What an absolutely outstanding military leader Chester Nimitz was. I don't know why he doesn't have more books written about him than he does. I suppose it's because he wasn't really interested in publicity and he wasn't more directly involved in famous battles. And by that I mean that he wasn't kind of hands-on, directly leading ships and men into battle. But as everybody knows, he was clearly instrumental in bringing on those battles, staging them, and then he was responsible, I think, for winning the war in the Pacific. Now, this book by Craig Symonds tells the story of how he did it. It's really thoroughly researched. And the author, Craig Symonds, is a professor at Annapolis, so he knows what he's talking about. This book about Nimitz gave me the chance to view the war in the Pacific from what I'll call a 30,000-foot level, and it tells an absolutely great story. Nimitz took command of the Pacific Fleet shortly after Christmas 1941. He had a three-part assignment. First, he had to be sure to protect Hawaii and Midway. Second, he had to protect the supply lines that run from the west coast of the U.S. to Australia and New Zealand. And third, and most important, he had to bring the fight to the Japanese early and often. Now, even though the attack at Pearl Harbor took out a bunch of battleships and fundamentally wrecked the Pacific Fleet, he still had some important assets at his disposal. Now, these included the physical facilities at Pearl Harbor, fuel tanks, dockyards, a submarine base. He had 3 carriers and a bunch of submarines, and he had men. He pulled all this stuff together in a really sophisticated way to totally accomplish his mission. Now, where you would think that the third part of his mission, take the fight to the Japanese early and often, was kind of at odds with the first 2 mainly defensive orders. But he managed to do that without compromising anything else, either of those first 2 things. He had to figure out how to balance the risks that were involved in offensive operations with his requirement to minimize the risk to the fleet that he needed to handle the defensive nature of the first 2 assignments. And as you know, he pulled it off really well. Figure this. In just the first half of 1942, his Pacific Fleet carried out first the Doolittle raid, which took the war home to Tokyo, even if it was only just a little bit. But it let Japan know that the U.S. could and would project power all the way across the Pacific. Second, he committed a big part of his fleet to fight the Battle of the Coral Sea. And that battle slowed down dramatically Japanese expansion into the South Pacific. And then finally, he was the key spark plug in bringing on and winning the Battle of Midway. And Midway is, I think, certainly one of the few decisive naval battles in history. In fact, it could be the most important win in history, maybe more important than Trafalgar. And he did all of this with a crippled and, frankly, obsolete fleet. He got all this stuff together into a winning formula. You know, the assets, the facilities, the carriers, the subs. But maybe his greatest accomplishment was in people management. He was able to deal effectively, very effectively, with a super difficult boss, Admiral Ernest King. He managed to get along with the other top commander in the Pacific, and was maybe one of the all-time biggest egotists in history. And that, of course, would be Douglas MacArthur. And he effectively led a group of talented, sometimes cranky, wildly different personalities who were his principal subordinates. For the most part, he got all those subordinates to work together more or less harmoniously, and his ability to get the best out of each one could really be a management textbook for business schools. The internal squabbles he had to deal with seem in 2024 to be almost unbelievable. To give some examples, he had to smooth out problems between the Marines and the Army. He had to deal with a conflict inside the Navy between carrier officers and service commanders. He had to deal with squabbles between the Navy headquarters in Washington and his staff and his ship commanders. And of course, he had to resolve serious, really important differences of opinion about the overall strategy we should pursue in the Pacific. Now, there are some historians who argue that once the U.S. economy got fully geared up for this war, there was no way at all that we could lose it. Yeah, maybe so. But that view overlooks the fact that you need somebody to bring all that economic output together and apply it in such a way that you achieve victory as quickly as possible and with the least amount of casualties. Admiral Nimitz did exactly that, even recognizing that he made a few mistakes along the way. Now, there's a whole lot more that could be said about Admiral Nimitz. Check out any of the podcasts that discuss him in much more detail, and I especially recommend the ones that involve senior Navy officers. They've got a whole lot more insight into this remarkable man than I do. In the meantime, for any of you military history buffs out there, I fully recommend Nimitz at War by Craig Symonds. See you next week.